it's two polar opposites. On one hand, he's portrayed, as he is in the Catholic Church, as a preeminent personality. On the other hand, he's like wrong about everything. And Paul says you're wrong about everything.
Time for one more question. Caller, you're live on the air. Go ahead with your question. This is Joseph Farrar.
Okay, so my question is, it kind of dovetails with the last one about Paul, and that's, is it possible that Paul was a Herodian infiltrator acting on behalf of the Empire of Rome, or is it possible that Paul was actually the Shimon Kifa spoken of in the Midrash, as, I mean, I guess that means Simon Peter, but is it possible it was actually Paul sent in by the sages to undermine the movement and distance the movement because of its insurrection undertones?
For those of you who just want to stick around short, so the short answer is, the answer to your first question is yes, and the answer to your second question is no. If you don't want to stick around, that's the short answer. So that Paul was working with Rome. Now, Paul doesn't claim to be a Roman citizen, but that claim is made for him in the book of Acts. In the first century, it wasn't a simple matter to be a citizen of Rome. Later on, it was much more common in later centuries, but in the first century. But was Paul working on behalf of Rome? No question about it. No question about it. And in fact, Paul says the astounding, in an indisputed letter, in his last letter, not coincidentally, addressing churches that he had not yet visited in Rome. And he urges the churches in Rome, he urges them to be completely subject to the Roman Empire. Why should you conform to whatever the authority of the Roman Empire? So no person will say, don't start in with the Roman Empire. Why? Pragmatic. The Roman Empire will kill you. No. He says openly that there is no authority except from God, and that the empire was instituted by God, and if you rebel against Rome, then you are rebelling against God. And I encourage you, please read Romans 13, 1 and 2 and 3. There are much more than this. Paul is definitely acting on behalf of Rome. He says it openly. He says that the empire was instituted by God. This is the empire that would come to destroy the Second Temple. He wasn't alive. He was very unlikely alive. He could have been. If you buy the story that he was killed under Nero, fine. I'm not going into why. Someone one day will ask me. I think Paul died in Spain. I think those stories are later inventions. And Paul admits in Romans that he's going to Spain. He spent time in Rome, but he moved on. But that's not germane. Paul was very pro-Roman, very much so. These are not conspiracy theories. Paul explicitly says that the empire, the Rishoyim of the empire, Titus and Vespasian. Now, he wasn't alive at that time. He was a contemporary of them. But that's what would emerge. It's unbelievable. He was pro-Roman. Your second question, was Paul the same person as Shimon that's identified in rabbinical literature? The answer is absolutely not. Simon was Peter. And that means he was a plant. According to this legend, I've chose every word carefully. It's a Jewish legend, but it's a strong legend. I can't prove it. This is a very strong legend that the real historical Shimon, the real historical Peter, Simon, was really never believed in any of this stuff. And he was planted by the rabbis to move Christianity out of the synagogue. Early Christianity was in the synagogue. It means it was a heretical sect of Judaism. It was a big, big, big problem, and they did not want it in. Legend goes that they asked this fellow Shimon, get it out and get it to Rome. Get it out, because this movement will metastasize. Can't have it in. And actually, the legend goes, he was very disconcerted that he would have to infiltrate the early Christian movement to do this, as you can imagine, and he was assured that he has a place in the world to come if he would carry out this task. So goes the legend. It may be this explains why Peter comes off as the Schlemazel in the Christian Bible. He's a highly inconsistent figure who in one way is presented to us as a preeminent apostle, a preeminent disciple. He's there at the Transfiguration. He's there wherever. He's making a big speech. Pentecost, he's right dead center everything. He's the one who we are told Jesus says to this church will be, you're the rock, hence the name, and the church will be built on you. And this is where the Catholics take that there's a pope from this. So in one sense, this is very interesting, and those of you who've been Christians will appreciate this. So in one sense, he appears as a preeminent apostle, but on the other hand, he's constantly just tripping and making mistakes, and he's getting everything wrong. He's denying Jesus. How many times? It depends which, but he's denying him. Why do you have this weird, complicated personality? He thinks he shouldn't eat with Gentiles. He doesn't know any better. He has to have a vision of a sheet lowering down from heaven with unclean animals, with a voice from heaven saying, kill them and you may eat it. And he's arguing, what do you mean? This is not kosher. Really, he's like, it's two polar opposites. On one hand, he's portrayed, as he is in the Catholic Church, as a preeminent personality. On the other hand, he's like wrong about everything. And Paul says you're wrong about everything. So you wonder to yourself, what would contribute to this, of this complex, conflicting narrative about Peter? So this legend, I'm not saying I believe this legend, but this legend would explain it away. This legend would be consistent with that. If Paul was definitely into this, Paul was not a plant, not any of those things. Paul was in it for Paul. Paul wanted to be the center of attention. He was a vicious person. All of his life he was vicious. When he wasn't a Christian, he was vicious. I don't believe the story about Stephen, that he stood by or took part in the assassination of Stephen. I don't believe that story ever happened. I don't believe it ever happened. That story is completely concocted to show how Christians should be willing to die for their religion, which is very important to the author of Luke Acts. Luke Acts is consumed with martyrdom and how to die properly as a Christian, which would be consistent with views of the dating of Luke Acts. So I don't believe that story. But Paul was just, wherever he was trouble. He was a troublemaker here and he's a troublemaker there. You see people today, right? How many people you know of? They were once a Muslim and they were troublemakers there, and then they become a Christian, they're troublemakers there. And then they jump to another Christian, they're trouble. The problem, wherever they go, they get themselves all kinds of crazy trouble. They're Muslim becomes a Christian. They're always just fighting with everybody. They can't get along with anybody. You know a lot of people like this. They just are troublesome personalities who are always adding to their importance, and no one can get along with them. And maybe that explains why Paul had female companions, because women did not pose a threat to him. They weren't going to challenge his authority, but men did. So Paul was not on board at all. Paul was into Paul. He wasn't an infiltrator. The legend is on Simon. On that, I can't tell you. And the reason I can't tell you, I wouldn't say more, is it is a fantastic claim. This legend, it's really quite fantastic. And fantastic claims require fantastic evidence, and that level of evidence is not strong enough. It certainly is pointing us in a direction, would be consistent with it. It does solve a lot of issues. It's like systems theory, but in studying the Bible where you have, or any text that purports to be a religious text. So you have this conundrum and you're looking for a solution. And very often the solution that is correct, it's like Occam's razor, is the one where one solution seems to solve all the problems. So there's the same thing in engineering and math and in any science. You can apply it to this also, that you have all these problems, and if you have one solution, it solves all the problems. So that tends to get everybody's attention. So the answer to the first question is definitely Paul was on board with Rome, definitely. And he was, and even describes his being in prison, like he was in the Howard Johnsons. I mean, that's how the end of Acts is. And he definitely was not working on behalf of the Jews. He was working on behalf of Paul, and he was a highly insincere person for whom I would not want to meet or have dinner with. Thank you very much for your thoughtful question. If you enjoyed this program, please like and subscribe.
אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא ועת נעשה בחפצו כל אזי מלך שמו נקרא ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא והוא היה והוא הווה